Silence is often mistaken for weakness, giving up, or pure emotional burnout. But in some relationships, silence becomes the strongest message of all. It shows up without warning. No last fight, no dramatic goodbye, no final attempt to be understood one more time. Just a sudden empty space where care, effort, and emotional energy used to live. This is the moment many people misunderstand, especially avoidant people. Most assume that when an empath finally goes quiet, the avoidant gets exactly what they always wanted. No more heavy talks, no more requests for closeness, no more pressure to open up, no more expectations, just space, just freedom. But the real story is more layered than that. What first feels like relief can slowly become confusion, discomfort, and even an emotional breakdown that happens in private. The distance that once felt safe starts creating questions that cannot be pushed away. Old conversations replay, memories grow louder, regret gets harder to escape. And the person who always seemed so sure about needing space suddenly comes face to face with feelings they spent years trying not to feel. The bond between an empath and an avoidant often follows the same painful rhythm. One reaches for connection, the other steps back. One wants understanding, the other protects themselves with distance. The empath keeps giving, keeps hoping, keeps believing that patience and love will someday soften the walls. The avoidant keeps pulling away whenever emotion gets too strong. This can go on for months, sometimes years. Then one day, everything shifts. The empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops trying to prove their worth, stops trying to save a bond they have been carrying alone. And what happens after that is something almost nobody talks about. Stay with this, because the deeper reason behind that silence changes everything. For a long time, the empath is usually the one holding the connection together. When communication breaks, the empath starts the talk. When conflict creates distance, the empath reaches out first. When confusion grows, the empath tries to fix it. Even after being hurt, they often come back with more patience, more understanding, and one more attempt to reconnect. This repeated pattern creates something the avoidant may never openly admit. It creates certainty. Somewhere deep down, they begin to expect the relationship to survive almost anything. They expect the empath to return. Not always because they enjoy causing pain, but because the cycle becomes normal. The empath gets hurt, pulls back for a moment, then comes back. It happens again and again until it feels permanent. The avoidant may never say this out loud. They may not even think it in clear words, but their behavior often reveals the same quiet belief. The connection will still be there tomorrow. The empath will still care tomorrow. The relationship can be dealt with later. Hard conversations can wait. Emotional responsibility can wait. Vulnerability can wait. Time feels endless because the empath has shown loyalty, patience, and emotional endurance so many times before. What makes this dynamic even stronger is that the empath often gives reassurance while getting very little back. They become the one who tries to understand instead of judge, the one who looks beneath behavior and sees pain instead of only seeing flaws. While many people would leave after repeated emotional distance, the empath often stays far longer than most. They keep offering grace long after others would have walked away. And in many cases, the avoidant grows used to this rare kind of acceptance without fully seeing how rare it truly is. That is where the hidden dependence begins. It does not always look like need, but it is there. Then comes the turning point. The empath gets tired. Not loud, not bitter, not trying to teach a lesson, just tired. The constant effort starts to feel one-sided. The repeated letdowns pile up. The endless waiting drains hope instead of building it. Eventually, a quiet moment arrives when the empath no longer has the energy to carry the whole relationship by themselves. There is no grand speech, no final emotional performance, no dramatic exit. There is only silence. For the avoidant, this silence feels different from past distance, but they may not notice right away. At first, life seems normal. Their daily routine continues. There are no long messages asking for answers, no emotional talks demanding attention, no pressure to engage, no expectations hanging in the air. For someone who often feels overwhelmed by emotional intensity, this can feel like relief in the beginning. The pressure is gone. The relationship becomes quiet. The demand for connection fades into the background. For a short time, the avoidant may even feel lighter, like a burden has been lifted, like they can breathe again. And this is where many people get confused. They expect instant regret, instant panic, instant sadness. But that is not always how this works. The first emotion is often relief, because the avoidant's deepest fear is usually tied to pressure, obligation, or the feeling of being trapped inside emotion they cannot control. So when that pressure disappears, the nervous system relaxes. It makes sense. But do not miss this part. Relief is not the end of the story. It is only the first chapter. Because when the silence keeps going and the empath does not return, the feeling starts to change. That is when the real impact begins. And if you have ever lived this pattern, you already know what comes next can feel stranger than the conflict itself. As days become weeks, something subtle starts happening. The silence stays. The empath does not return with another message. No new effort appears. No emotional conversation begins again. The familiar cycle breaks, and the avoidant slowly realizes this is not like the other times. This silence does not feel temporary. It does not feel like a short pause between chapters. It begins to feel like the chapter itself may truly be ending. And that is where uncertainty enters the room. Avoidant people often prefer distance because distance feels controlled. They decide how much they share. They decide how close someone gets. They decide when they engage and when they step back. That sense of control helps them feel safe. But once the empath truly goes silent, that control begins to slip. Suddenly, the avoidant cannot predict the future of the bond. They do not know what the empath is thinking. They do not know what the empath is feeling. They do not know if the relationship still exists emotionally at all. The certainty they quietly relied on starts to crack. Questions begin showing up, and they are not easy to silence. What if this person is really gone? What if they finally stopped waiting? What if they accepted that nothing will change? What if someone else enters their life? What if there is no chance to return later when it feels more convenient, safer, easier? For maybe the first time, the avoidant is forced to face a truth they spent years avoiding. Relationships are not permanent just because they survived before. People reach limits. Patience runs out. Emotional investment fades when it is not returned. The absence of the empath creates a vacuum, and human beings are wired to notice what is missing. Little memories begin surfacing without warning. A message once ignored now means something. A moment once taken for granted now feels heavy. The mind starts circling back again and again, and this is where relief slowly turns into unease. Keep listening, because this shift is where the emotional balance of the whole relationship changes. The distance that once felt safe starts to feel different. Not because the avoidant suddenly becomes a different person, but because the meaning of the distance changes. Distance chosen by them feels familiar. Distance chosen by someone else feels unstable. And instability often creates anxiety. The empath is no longer emotionally available on standby. The connection is no longer sitting quietly in the background, waiting to be reopened whenever the avoidant feels ready. Now it exists beyond their control. That shift can be deeply unsettling. And as the silence continues, another process begins under the surface. Many avoidant people spend years focused on outside situations instead of inside emotions. During hard conversations, their attention often moves toward the other person's reaction. During conflict, they focus on getting away from discomfort. During emotional talks, they look for relief, for distance, for an exit. The empath's constant presence, without meaning to, becomes a distraction. There is always another conversation, another issue, another misunderstanding, another emotional wave to manage. But once the empath steps out of the picture, that distraction disappears too. Silence creates space, empty space, and empty space can become painfully loud. There are no more texts to ignore, no more emotional demands to resist, no more arguments to escape. There is only stillness, and inside that stillness, the avoidant becomes more aware of their own thoughts than they have been in a very long time. Thoughts once easy to bury begin rising. Memories grow sharper. Regret becomes easier to hear. Questions return over and over. Many avoidants learned long ago that vulnerability feels dangerous, dependence feels risky, and emotional exposure feels unsafe. Over time, avoidance became a survival habit, automatic, almost invisible. But silence removes many of the old escape routes, and once the usual noise is gone, buried emotions often begin to rise. This is the part most people do not see from the outside. The collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is silent, too. Without the empath constantly reaching out, suppressed feelings begin coming closer to the surface. Sadness appears in small flashes. Longing shows up without warning. Guilt starts to build. Curiosity gets stronger. The avoidant may not even understand what they are feeling at first. In fact, they may struggle to name it at all. They only know something feels off. Something keeps pulling at them. Something about the silence feels heavier than expected. And for perhaps the first time in a long time, they are forced to sit with themselves. That can be one of the hardest experiences for an avoidant person. At the same time, another realization often starts forming. The empath was not just another partner, another friend, another passing connection. The empath was often one of the few people willing to look beyond the defenses. Many people lose patience with avoidant behavior quickly. Many stop trying to understand. Many leave after repeated emotional unavailability. But empaths usually move differently. Instead of focusing only on behavior, they search for the pain beneath it. Instead of immediately judging withdrawal, they ask what fear caused it. Instead of meeting distance with rejection, they often meet it with concern. That kind of understanding is rare, very rare. The empath gives chances other people would never give. Second chances, third chances, eighth chances. More than they should. Not because they enjoy pain, but because they truly believe people can heal, change, and grow. For a long time, the avoidant may underestimate the value of that kind of acceptance. It becomes familiar, expected, part of the background. Only after the empath emotionally leaves does the value become visible. The avoidant starts comparing other interactions to that old bond. Other people may not be as patient. They may not be as forgiving. They may not spend hours trying to understand hidden feelings.
Slowly, the avoidant begins to see what the empath really brought into their life. Not perfection, not constant happiness, something rarer. Emotional persistence, softness, understanding, a willingness to see the person hiding behind the walls. One of the biggest myths about avoidant people is the idea that if they are hurting, everyone will know. People expect clear signs, late-night calls, emotional confessions, a dramatic attempt to come back, visible heartbreak. But avoidant psychology often does not look like that at all. In many cases, the deepest struggle happens where nobody can see it. The collapse is not always loud. It is not always obvious. It is not always visible to friends, family, or even the empath who walked away. Some avoidants look completely normal while going through one of the most emotionally confusing seasons of their life. They still go to work. They still socialize. They still post online. They still follow routines. To the outside world, nothing seems different. And this is why many empaths convince themselves that the avoidant never cared. They look at the outside behavior and assume there is no real impact. They assume the silence changed nothing. But inner pain does not always show up on the outside. Some people process pain by expressing it. Others process pain by containing it. Avoidants often belong to the second group. As time passes, the mind starts doing something it was never forced to do while the relationship was still active. It begins replaying the past, not once, not twice, over and over. Conversations that once felt small now return with force. Specific moments play back in detail. Certain words become hard to forget. The avoidant may think about situations they dismissed months earlier. They may start seeing old arguments from a new angle. They may begin wondering if the empath was trying to tell them something they simply could not hear at the time. This replay can be exhausting because there is no active relationship left to distract them, no new argument to focus on, no fresh message to avoid. Just the same old memories, now louder than before. If this part feels painfully familiar, stay with it, because the next shift explains why silence can hit harder than confrontation ever did. At first, the avoidant may try to push these thoughts away. They may bury themselves in work, focus on tasks, stay busy, spend more time with friends, throw energy into hobbies, routines, anything that creates movement. But some thoughts keep coming back. The brain naturally searches for unfinished emotional stories. It wants closure. It wants meaning. It wants answers. And the empath's absence leaves behind questions that remain open. This is often where regret starts entering the picture. Not always as one huge wave. Sometimes it comes in pieces. A memory rises. A realization follows. The avoidant remembers a moment when the empath was asking to be understood. They remember vulnerability being offered and not received. They remember an opportunity to be honest that they avoided. Slowly, the relationship starts looking different, wider, clearer, more complete. And this creates a confusing emotional state because avoidants are often not used to sitting with regret for very long. Their pattern has usually been to move away from discomfort, not deeper into it. But silence removes many of the usual exits. The relationship is no longer active. There is nothing left to dodge in real time. There is only the emotional truth that remains after the dust settles. Confusion becomes common here. Part of the avoidant still believes space is what they wanted. Another part feels deeply unsettled by what that space has cost them. They may not understand why they keep thinking about someone they once pushed away. They may question why the memories keep returning. One day they feel detached. The next day, something tiny hits them hard. A week later, they tell themselves they have moved on, and then one small reminder brings everything back again. That emotional inconsistency can feel disorienting. It does not move in a straight line. It comes and goes. It confuses even the person feeling it. And because they do not always have the language for what is happening inside, the struggle stays hidden longer. Many avoidants also go through a strange kind of numbness during this time. Instead of feeling sadness clearly, they may feel emotionally flat, distant, even disconnected from themselves. And that numbness is often misunderstood. People assume numbness means there is no feeling there. But numbness can be a shield, a protective response to emotions that feel too tangled or too heavy to process all at once. The feelings exist, but the access point feels blocked. Because of this, the avoidant may know the silence matters while still being unable to describe why. They know the absence changed something. They know the empath meant more than they admitted. Yet putting that inner shift into words feels hard, sometimes almost impossible. Another layer appears when they try to build new connections. During the relationship, the empath often created a level of emotional depth that seemed ordinary only because it was always there. Only after losing it does the avoidant start to see how unusual it really was. New people may come into their life, new conversations may begin, new chances for connection may appear. But something feels different. The emotional depth is not the same. The patience is not the same. The willingness to understand is not the same. The feeling of emotional safety is not the same. This can create a fresh kind of tension. For so long, the avoidant may have focused mainly on the flaws of the old connection. Now they start noticing the qualities they overlooked. The empath's strengths become more visible in absence than they ever were in presence. This is one of the quiet ironies of human attachment. What we do not value properly while it is near us can become painfully clear once it is gone. And when that truth lands, even softly, it can shake the whole emotional story. Because now the avoidant is not just missing a person, they are recognizing the rarity of what that person offered, and that realization can be much harder to ignore than any argument ever was. As this process continues, another deep shift starts unfolding. For years, the balance of power in the relationship often revolved around distance. Whenever emotions became intense, the avoidant could create space. Whenever things felt overwhelming, they could withdraw. Intentionally or not, they often controlled access to the relationship. The empath adapted to that structure. The empath waited, reached out, tried again, stayed emotionally open. That pattern can last a very long time because empaths often believe enough love, enough patience, enough consistency will one day create safety. Then silence arrives, and suddenly the whole structure changes. For maybe the first time, the avoidant is no longer controlling access. The empath is. This shift can feel more unsettling than people realize because it changes the emotional architecture of the bond. The avoidant is used to deciding when closeness happens, used to deciding how much emotional access another person receives, used to stepping back and expecting the relationship to still be there later. Now those choices no longer belong to them. The empath is no longer waiting at the emotional door, no longer standing by for one more chance, no longer available whenever the avoidant feels ready. That changes everything.
The avoidant is no longer responding to pursuit. They are responding to absence. And absence affects the mind in powerful ways. When someone keeps pursuing us, we spend our energy managing their presence. When they disappear fully, we spend our energy trying to understand their absence. Why did they stop? What changed inside them? Why are they no longer reaching out? Why does this silence feel so much louder than all the words that came before it? There is no easy answer because there is no conversation happening anymore. No updates, no reassurance, no clarity, only uncertainty. And uncertainty creates a kind of psychological tension that constant pursuit never could. For years, the empath may have explained their pain again and again. They may have spoken clearly about their needs. They may have expressed loneliness, disappointment, and hurt many times. But over time, repetition can reduce urgency. Familiar pain becomes easy to ignore when someone keeps staying anyway. Silence does the opposite. Silence removes the usual noise. It removes access. It removes certainty. And when that happens, curiosity rises fast. The avoidant begins paying attention in a way they often never did before. Not because the empath suddenly became more valuable overnight, but because the absence reveals a value that had been overlooked for too long. Then comes one of the hardest realizations of all. The empath has changed. Not for a few days, not because they are trying to prove a point, not because they are quietly waiting to be chased this time. Changed for real. The avoidant begins to notice signs of this shift.
The empath no longer seems interested in proving their worth, no longer explaining why they deserved better, no longer trying to win understanding from someone who could not fully meet them. For a long time, the empath's energy was directed outward, toward fixing, toward healing, toward saving, toward keeping the bond alive. Now that energy turns inward, toward peace, toward self-respect, toward healing themselves. This can be deeply hard for an avoidant to process because it breaks one of their oldest assumptions. The empath was always there. The empath always cared. The empath always tried. Now the avoidant is looking at a version of that person who no longer centers the relationship. That can feel shocking. Not because the empath became cruel, not because they became cold, but because they became emotionally independent. The person who once waited now keeps moving. The person who once chased now stays still.
The person who once searched for outside validation now begins to give that validation to themselves. And if you really understand that shift, you understand why the silence becomes impossible to ignore.